like to start this evening and just welcome all of you. I'm Vicki Berry. I'm the director of the OSU Museum of Art, and we have with us, and I suspect we might have a few other people joining us this evening as we go along. We are lucky to have contributing authors for the catalog and our guest curator for the exhibition and editor for the catalog with us this evening. And I wanted to do this as an informal gathering. We are honoring our art advocates who are the fundraising volunteers, but fundraising arm of the museum. And we're very grateful for their support that helps provide public programming and outreach to our community. And our community is big, large, you know, we're from Oklahoma, we think big. And so we really serve many, many individuals in that. We have the honor at the OSU Museum of Art working with Carol Motor and the Doel Reed Center and the university at large in taking care of the Doel Reed collection on behalf of the center. And that is a nice partnership for us to be in here to support with this exhibition as well. We work with the Edmund Lowe Library and they hold the collective, the papers, the personal papers and documents from the Doel Reed estate that Martha Reed stewarded, you know, passed on to us. And so we're grateful. We have a lot of elements in together that go to supporting this incredible collection and learning center, activity center. What is it you call yourself, Carol? You're many things, right?
We just call ourselves the center, the Doel Reed Center. If we have to use an adjective, we use educational.
There you go, which we're all in the business of doing. Quickly to say thank you to a lot of donors and supporters who made, sponsors who made this exhibition and the catalog and everything else we're doing, the programming happen. Kent and Jeanette Young, Neil and Laura Buck, the Doel Reed Center has been supported. The Von Benneberg's the second endowed chair in art, which is Rebecca, one of many titles that are my esteemed colleagues carry. And the art advocates, of course, and a special thanks to Carl and Marilyn Thoma Foundation and the Terra Foundation for American Art for supporting our catalog. Okay, tonight we have joining with us, and I'm not going to read all the titles if you don't mind, Rebecca Brienen and Carol Motor. Yeah, wave, guys. All your names are down there. Cori North. Cori's joining us. I don't think, Cori, you haven't seen the exhibition yet, right?
Not in person, but I sure loved the PDF with all the photos.
Great. Well, you will maybe see it at Wichita, we hope.
That's what I'm planning on so far.
That's great. And then Mark White has joined us. Hey, Mark, thank you for joining us. And then there's me. Okay, so quickly, just sharing a few installation photographs. I thought you might enjoy that, seeing it if you have not been here. Just a little background. Looks kind of cleaned up and professional, doesn't it? Yep, lost Neil. We can go back to these if we have any desire to do that. Okay, Rebecca, I pulled this out of the materials. So this is Doel's studio. I prepared some questions. Perhaps you'd like to go first because we do have to allow you to go pick up family members at the end of this. So anything you want to share with our group about the process that you went through? I know you started a long time ago.
Oh my goodness, I started so long ago. So when you look at this picture, you can see those sort of piles of exhibition catalogs up there on the shelf. I don't know if you can see that. There's kind of those little shelves. So there was so much material. So archival material, letters, documents related to Doel Reed's life and legacy that were still, on the property. So that became this really incredibly rich archive for me to dive into to learn more about Doel's life, about his art, and ultimately to kind of contextualize him within a larger group of artists in the Midwest, and of course, eventually also in the Southwest. So, I mean, I love working with archives because you feel like you kind of get to know people from their correspondence. You get to know their their strain, well, both curious things about them, things that they're obsessed with. Doel kept carbon copies of most of the letters he wrote, so he was a very careful man. And these letters, I've really enjoyed reading through the letters because they give this really personal insight. So people writing to Doel about works of art, which really added a richness to it. And I could babble on forever, of course, but I really enjoyed, because I wasn't originally an Americanist. So full disclosure here, I trained as a 17th century Dutch specialist, which is why there are a couple of mentions of Dutch artists in the catalog. But I trained as an art historian and specialized in painting and printmaking. So this became kind of a natural extension of my interest from an earlier period. And I've just found it so rewarding and enriching. And I've just been thrilled that I was able to have this opportunity.
Well, so I know we're going to show, if we have time and you have not watched it, there is a brief, it's about 5 minutes of a video that O State TV produced. Anyone in the crowd seen it? Besides, yeah. So, oh, well, yes. Museum staff, you better have seen it. So we'll show that because it does give a little bit of the answer to the questions I have. It's like, what's it like to be behind the scenes? And it brings several of the members of the museum's team and a curatorial assistant that Rebecca utilized. But maybe you wouldn't mind talking a little bit about how you were able to bring in graduate students, students to assist you in the process of your research.
Well, I mean, some of the students also were working for you at the museum. Mm-hmm. So when the museum went down with, I think it was a truck, I think it was Carla and a few other museum staff went down to Taos, or up to Taos, I'm not sure, over to Taos.
Over.
Over.
Over and up.
with a big truck from facilities management here, and brought back all of these things that were in storage, plus all these other materials. I mean, Jessica was at the museum, Jessica Provencher, who graduated with an MA in art history from our program, and now I believe works at Crystal Bridges. Is that correct? Yeah, which is great. Thrilled. So she was going through those materials while she was still a student. I had students. I had Tiffany, I had Caitlin, and then Cassidy, who came in as a research, really kind of a curatorial assistant, but after she had completed, after she primarily completed her degree in art history, which is of course fully completed at this time. So it's been really important for me all throughout this process to involve graduate students in this kind of hands-on learning. And frankly, I don't have necessarily have time to go through everything and to organize everything. So it's been really wonderful to have their assistance all throughout this process.
And the paper documents we had in boxes, and there were things like, electric bills and, right. I mean, Carol lived this because she was managing all the storage units that had all these materials in them, right? So, yeah. So you had to sort through a lot of esoteric material in order to find
junk mail. Okay, junk mail, yes, and notices of bills that were due and renewals for magazines. I mean, just random stuff, and then you would find these really wonderful letters from people who had seen an exhibition or seen something in a museum, and they really wanted this work by Reed. And
Yeah, so the interesting thing is, Martha Reed said that she left the studio in exactly the state it was when her father stopped working there in 1985, about a month before he died. And that's really true because, as Rebecca is saying, there was everything that was in there, including things that you think might be able to be thrown out. But of course, no archivist wants to throw anything out, even electric bills.
And they were there, sometimes, how should we say, the climate was not always that, at least it wasn't wet.
Right, so it needs to be
condition.
said, right, that Doel Reed's studio, it used to be a goat shed. And so it's certainly not a climate-controlled archival environment.
No, dusty. And still going through those letters, I was looking through some of the letters actually this afternoon, and they're still really dusty. So there's like authentic Taos dust that just impregnates them and will continue to for the rest of their existence.
And I know, because I witnessed it a number of times, that we housed all of these documents here at the museum, and we have an unfinished lower level that's not public. But I know Rebecca spent many an hour downstairs, or sent her assistants downstairs to weed through all this paperwork. We will eventually be passing on paperwork to the Edmund Lowe Library. They have some that we're transitioning over. We just found it was easier to support Rebecca by having it here or in her office on campus, so that she didn't have to trek into the, researchers don't always work 9 to 5 hours. So it makes it a little bit easier, right?
I would say working in the basement of the museum was like working in a fallout shelter.
Yeah.
And there was no cell phone service or Wi-Fi. So you just felt like you were in this completely space apart from normal reality, which was, I suppose, helpful for looking at older materials.
Yeah, that's great. So Cori, I was enjoying kind of rereading your essay in the catalog, and one thing that occurred to me is it kind of gave a really interesting perspective on Doel Reed's temperament. Like he didn't pay his membership. and yet he was trying to get in, he was really working the scene to get into exhibitions. And I wondered, I know you put together an exhibition. So was it 2015? I'm trying to remember.
Yes,
okay. So tell us what it was like, because you have quite a few Doel Reed objects in the Burger Sensen gallery. What was it like assembling that exhibition? Because I don't think much had been done prior.
No, as far as we knew, there hadn't been a real retrospective of all of Doel Reed's various works in painting and prints. And the Sensen Gallery is lucky enough to have archival repositories of letters and Sensen's day books, where he'd record things such as Doel Reed has not paid his dues to be a prairie watercolor painter that year, but they still kept him on the roster anyway, because he was known as a really, really generous soul. And, so everybody loved to work with him. The gallery, because of the family connection, the direct personal collection of Berger Sensen, and then his daughter also continued inviting Doel Reed to exhibit in Lindsborg in Kansas, and she continued to acquire his works. Sensen himself was a little more thrifty, so he would exchange things, and even for things such as plumbing and yard work, he would exchange and try to give his prints and sketches and stuff in it for that. So back in the mid-30s, he and Doel Reed exchanged letters and started exchanging prints for each of their artist collections. And they started off with Mexican prints from each artist, because Sanzane had gone to Mexico in 35 for a second trip. And I think Doel Reed went in 34, was it the summer before that?
It's either 34 or 32. Forgive me, I don't have those numbers quite off the top of my head, but yeah.
I think it was 34. So they were
Yeah.
probably really excited about exchanging their opinions and impressions of old Mexico. But we know they would have known each other by the early 30s, because Doel Reed was invited to join the Prairie Printmakers in 1932, when they started inviting members, the very beginning of 1931. So we're not quite sure when or where the two men met and started collecting each other's works. We suspect it had a lot to do with Sanzane's student, Oscar Bruce Jacobson, who was getting the art department really galvanized, and eventually got the museum, which is now the Fred Jones Museum that Mark led for so long. And being the little linchpin there, taking exhibitions from Kansas and showing them, and vice versa. Some of the Oklahoma artists then showed in Kansas. So we suspect the two men probably would have known each other in the late 20s, not so long after Doel Reed arrived to Stillwater. So there's just a long history of Doel Reed collecting here in Lindsborg, and it'd been talked about doing an exhibition with all this surprising material we had stashed away, like some of these really fabulous paintings nobody knew that we had, that Margaret Sanzane collected. One of the pieces she collected on the installment plan, she wrote to Doel Reed and said, "Oh, I can't really afford it all at once, so could I pay a little at a time?" And he was nice enough to just send her the painting right away and not even wait. So we had people suggesting that we do a show after some of our supporters had helped with an Oscar Jacobson show at the Sanzane Gallery earlier. And so we had a lot of help putting together this exhibition back in 2015 to make the first Doel Reed splash in the American art world. Some of you that I noticed on this call were really a great support in trying to make that exhibition really an eyeful, and it was great. So we have built up our Doel Reed collection. So now we've got almost 30 pieces of our own, because we did borrow quite a few for that show from the Fred Jones Museum, and Mark White was so gracious in facilitating that. And we had a lot of nice prints from that collection, particularly, and a wonderful painting that went with one of our drawings. And then we had just a wonderful turnout from some private collections. So we thank everyone.
That's great.
We've borrowed some things from you, obviously, for this exhibition as well. So should mention that you've been very generous, and we very much appreciate that.
So Mark, do you want to comments, or do you want to address the question I posed, or anything new you'd like to talk about?
Well, let's see. I guess I can try to wrap all of that in. I've, just as a little bit of personal background, I've been working on Doel Reed since 1992, when my first graduate student paper was on Doel Reed. It was a terrible paper, and I was glad that Charlie Eldridge still gave me a decent grade on it. And so that actually kind of prompted me to want to go back to his career and do a little bit of work on it. And so ultimately the essay that Vicki and Rebecca asked me to provide is the culmination of research that I'd always been wanting to do. And eventually my scholarship, my knowledge kind of caught up, and I was able to write something that I at least could feel somewhat proud of. But as part of that, I was always trying to find ways to kind of shoehorn Doel Reed into permanent collection installations that we were doing at the Fred Jones Jr. Museum of Art. And it also led me to go and start talking with Martha when the relationship between Martha Reed and OSU began in, what was that? Was that 2005? Carol, do you remember?
Yeah, 2005, 2006 was when those conversations first started.
Okay. So I met Martha in 2005 officially, although I'd always wanted to meet her. I just had never had the opportunity to do so. And then I had a series of conversations with her over 2006. I would go and see her at the house there in Talpa and start building kind of on the research that I had done much, much earlier in my graduate student career. And getting to know Martha was really interesting. As far as an interesting story, I've got one that is sort of humorous, but also a little disturbing in some ways. So some of you may remember the Colonial Art Gallery in Oklahoma City. And they used to have an auction, say, every, I think, 4 months there for a while Willard Johnson was alive. And at one point, Willard had a painting that was signed just Reed, R-E-E-D. And he was promoting it as a Doel Reed because the guy that had sold it to him had told him that it was a Doel Reed. Well, having looked at Doel Reed for over a decade at that point, there was no way this was a Doel Reed painting, and the signature didn't match. And so I at one point pulled Willard aside and I said, Willard, this doesn't feel right to me. This, you know, he never really signed his paintings just Reed. It doesn't match his signature Reed. So I'm really, you know, I think you should think about this and maybe pull this out of the auction. And Willard being, you know, interested enough in my background said, okay, well, you know, based on what you're saying, yeah, I'll pull it. Well, what was it? I think maybe 6 months later, I'd had the opportunity to visit with Martha. And I mentioned that there was a painting in this auction that just didn't feel right. And I described it to her. And she said, that's my painting. Because Martha was an artist in addition to being a clothing designer and so on. And she had described to me this painting. They routinely made trips to the Cimarron River. And at one point they had a party on the Cimarron River, and that's what this painting depicted. It was a nighttime bonfire, and it was a very kind of surrealist painting. It was somewhat naive, didn't feel at all like what Doel Reed had been doing. And so I went back to Willard and I said, hey, you know, I just talked to Martha Reed, and she mentioned that this painting that was in your auction is actually her painting. So apparently what had happened then is that some guy whose name I do not know had visited Martha, had offered to buy that painting from her, but sort of on spec. In other words, he was going to buy it and then sell it to someone else, and then he would give her the money for it after he got that. Well, he never did that apparently, because he gave it to Willard. Willard had given him some money for the painting. He never gave any of that money to Martha, and had painted out the Martha in front of Reed in order to pass it off as a Doel Reed and get more money for it. So Willard still had the painting, and even though he was basically in the hole on it, he decided that he would give it back to her. So I got to transport this painting from Oklahoma City back to Taos, returned it to Martha because she had never been given any money for it. And thus kind of everything was right, except I don't know that if Willard ever got any money for that he gave to the guy in question. So that's kind of my interesting story in terms of Martha. I returned a painting to hers that had been fully attributed to her father. And hopefully everything worked out well in the end. But I have no idea what happened to that painting after Martha got it back. Did you all wind up with it, or did Martha turn around and sell it to someone else?
It's not in the collection, so I don't know what happened to it.
Okay. Well, she had it back at one point, so it should have gone to you all, but apparently she did something else with it. I'm sorry to say.
Never know. It might come up now. Get the word out. Thank you for sharing that. You know, it's always interesting to read the end notes or footnotes on these essays because there's all kinds of juicy material there, which is what stimulated me to ask because, you know, there was, Mark had done an interview with Martha. So I thought, well, he's got to have stories. He's definitely got to have stories. That's great. So Carol.
I was going to say, I think someone should collect all of the Martha stories. I think there should be a little volume of stories about Martha because she was such an interesting and remarkable woman whom I never had the opportunity to meet. But some of those stories I think are fairly, well, they're very interesting, humorous, and also just interesting.
So Carol, you've been involved with the Doel Reed Center probably longer than you'd like to admit, right?
Well, right. So I've been, I actually met Martha well before the Doel Reed Center happened, just by wandering into her shop in Taos many years ago before she closed it in the 80s. But I interacted quite a bit with Sally Mccorkle, who was the first director of the Doel Reed Center. There you have a photograph of Sally and her mother, and Elizabeth Max, who visited Martha a lot during the period when Martha had agreed to give the gift. And then in the years before she died, when OSU actually took over the property, so especially between 2006 and 2010. Sally Mccorkle, many of you know, is partly responsible for seeing the Doel Reed Center as something that the art department could really work with and develop and build up as a center. She took a lot of the early students over to the center at the beginning. The second director was Ed Walkowitz, who largely supervised a lot of the construction, and then I took over in 2014. This photograph that we have here is a very nice photograph of Martha in her shop, working with Lucy Archuleta, who is from Taos Pueblo, who was her assistant during many of the years that her shop was open and was one of her main seamstresses. We met with Lucy and her husband at the Doel Reed Center early on. And my husband said to Lucy's husband, well, you know, what do you think Martha would think about the renovation of this place? And he said, I don't think she'd like it. She didn't like people moving her stuff around. And in fact, Martha had a lot of stuff. One of the other, I mean, you see here a photograph of Doel Reed's studio as it was when OSU took over the property. If you look closely, you can see that that wall above the window is in really bad condition. The roof was leaking. The studio, as we said, Martha left the studio as it was when her father died, and that largely included not doing a whole lot of maintenance on that or the other buildings because she really didn't have very much money after she closed her shop. So this studio had to be, everything in the studio was photographed, and then everything was taken out and put in storage, and then the restoration took place. That was the first building that was restored when the center restoration started after 2011. This is a photograph of Doel's historic studio. So after we put everything back in, this is what the studio looked like. There are a few additions. So for example, you see on the wall there is a photograph of Doel in his studio in Stillwater, because Doel, then as now, The art department faculty did not get studio space on campus. They had to find their own studio space, and Doel rented a studio on 7th Street in Stillwater. And the photograph on the wall there is him in his studio in Stillwater. So, and you can see sort of in the corner there, Doel's historic press, which he had built for him by the students at Oklahoma A&M College to his specifications. And in the exhibition, there's the second copy of that press, which was used by Jay McVicker, who was Doel's student and then took over as head of the art department. And Jay also did aquatint printmaking, although his aquatints tended to have a little bit more color in them. But Jay was so used to using Doel Reed's press that when Doel Reed retired in 1959, he had another press built to the same specifications for him. And that's the one that is in the exhibition, since the original one Doel took with him to Taos and still remains in his studio. So this is another photograph. This is of the house, again, before renovation. You see there's a lot of fencing and dog runs, and there was an old well house where a lot of Martha's clothing was stored and not in very good condition. So most of this has been torn down and restored. Here's a photograph of the students in the newly restored home that was Martha Reed's home. And you see there's a giclée of a portrait of Martha in the background there in one of her signature outfits. And this is an English class that was meeting in her restored living room. So this is the restoration that Albert was a little dubious about whether Martha would like, since we moved a lot of her stuff out to do this. Do we have the image of that? Yes, that one. One of the things that I have found quite interesting about looking at the Doel Reed materials and looking at the relation of the family is the family was actually quite tight-knit and very supportive of each other. So Jane Reed met Doel. Actually, I just found out this interesting fact. Doel and Jane met at the Cincinnati Art Academy, but what I didn't know was that the day they met was the day that King Albert and Queen Elizabeth of Belgium came to Cincinnati. And apparently there was a big event where they rode through the park in an open carriage, and all the Art Academy students went, and that's when Doel and Jane met. So Jane was an artist herself, although seems to have given up her art career largely to support Doel, first Doel and then Jane. One of the things that I discovered also in some research is that Jane was very instrumental in helping Martha in her shop. Jane's father was a tailor. She was trained as a seamstress herself from very early on. She apparently is the one who did most of the intricate sewing and embroidery for Martha's designs when the shop was open. This photograph that we have right here, apparently in the late 1950s, before they moved back to Taos, Doel and Jane were in Taos. He had a summer studio, and Jane took up watercolors again. And this is one of her watercolor interiors. And you can see she's put a Doel Reed on the wall there. So, and even now, there are photographs of them at art events, at receptions, the whole family basically being very active in promoting art and the art community, both when they lived in Stillwater and when they moved to Taos.
Great, it's good information to share. I mean, I found it interesting that everyone brought a different perspective, you know, that assembled together gives us a better idea of the family and the scope of Doel Reed's career. And we do have.
I'd like to mention just this learning a little bit more about Martha and Jane and the family. The second generation of the two men artists were also friends. And Martha wrote the nicest letter to Margaret Sanzane right after Martha's father died in '85. Margaret's father, Birger, had died way back in '54. So, you know, she was bereaved a long time ago, but Martha wrote the nicest letter to tell Margaret all about her father's funeral and memorial services and scattering the ashes in the canyon lands.
Yeah, another interesting thing that we have in our materials that was shared with us by people who were very close to the Reeds are some recordings, which we've also shared with the museum. One that I think is really very interesting is a recording with that William Dickerson, who was one of the Prairie printmakers, did with Doel, we think in the early, maybe in '72, but sometime in the early '70s, and he interviewed him in Talpa at his studio, and the two of them, you know, longtime printmakers, have a wonderful discussion about printmaking and how they do it and so forth. And in that recording, Doel Reed mentions that he doesn't really consider himself to be a representational painter, that for him, content, emotion, and composition were foremost in his composing process. He mentions that he used to do plein air painting when he first started out, but when he got to Oklahoma, there was too much dust and too many bugs, and it wasn't very suitable for painting, so he started drawing instead. But the drawings for him were very conceptual. You know, he thought about the content, the emotion, the composition, and then basically just used it as a kind of general guideline to what kind of composition he'd like to put together. And that's why we have really, we mentioned Cori mentioned the relationship between the drawing and the painting. There are lots of cases of this where we have a conceptual drawing essentially, and then there's a print, and then there's a painting, and they all have slightly different compositions because Doel, you know, basically thought the content was most important. And he tells a story about Oscar Burninghouse coming to his studio, and Doel had done a painting of the Martinez Hacienda in Taos, and Burninghouse looked at it very dubiously and said, you know, Reed, I think you better go and check this out again because these colors are not right. And Doel said, oh, well, you know, I was trying to represent my idea of the emotions of the time and the people who lived in there over the centuries and just get a general conceptual feeling of the place. And Burninghouse paused for a minute and said, well, okay, I guess you can leave it like that. But the fact is that Doel himself tells this story, which also gives us a feeling of his personality. He obviously, you know, liked to tell stories, liked to interact with people, was a really sociable, and according to most of the people whom I have talked to who knew him well, really charming, wonderful person to be with.
Mm-hmm. And that's the funny thing, because when you see these photographs of Doel, he always looks so dour. Right? He looks socially awkward, frankly, and dour. But then you hear from individuals who actually knew him and members of the family, like, yeah, he could actually tell a good joke, and he was gregarious. And the funny thing is that that's not in the photographic evidence. That's only in this kind of oral history that we get from people who were close.
Yeah.
So the dangers of photography, I suppose, is part of it.
You know, I think the fact that he had such bad eyesight from having been gassed in the war and those really thick glasses maybe contribute to the fact that he looks as though he's not gregarious in some of these photos.
So do we have questions from our audience? Anyone have any burning questions to ask?
I was wondering if anybody knows what kind of light sources he had and painted by, and maybe if it was different light sources that he did with the aqua tint, if anyone knows.
Do you mean like in his studio?
Yeah, what was the lighting light in the goat? What was it? An old goat
In
shed?
the goat shed, right?
Yeah, I think that the lamps that are there are probably the lamps that were always there. So nothing special, certainly no like special studio lighting. It was pretty, I'd say pretty bare bones when it came to that.
Yeah, so, you know, the light in Taos, in Talpa, is of course very bright. And there were lots of windows in the goat shed studio. So, I mean, he did convert it. It didn't stay in its goat shed state. So, you know, there are a lot of windows in the front and windows across the side. So I think in the daylight, he probably had quite good light. I mean, that's true still now in the studio. In the daylight, in the main part of the studio, the light is very bright. You know, at night, he would have been working by these 40-watt bulbs.
And it still smells like a goat shed. Let's just be honest about it.
Yeah, especially when it's just a little humid.
Which fortunately in Talpa is not all.
Not always, right.
And
You know, and he was still painting from models, you know, well into his elderly years. I mean, he's in his 80s and he's still getting nude models. So
anyone else with some questions?
The archives that are held by the school, I've seen them listed online. How easy or is those available to be looked at?
So there are only some of them that are listed online, and those were actually materials that were brought over from Taos, probably during that initial period of contact with Martha, probably like around between probably 2005 and 2010. We're still working like every week on trying to catalog and to organize the materials that still remain. So they are not available for public at this point, just because they're being sorted. So do understand that these huge boxes that were, you know, taken by the museum and from Taos, from storage, sometimes from the home itself, that were brought back here to Oklahoma State. There was really often it seemed like there was no rhyme or reason. And I know people were helping to pack these boxes and preserve the materials, but you know, nobody had time to do a careful analysis of what was going into the individual boxes. So it was so exciting to to find Doel Reed's diary from World War I, for example, to find his Purple Heart, to find all different kinds of ephemeral objects related to his life. But they're just not searchable now in terms of the contents until we go through them and organize them better. I mean, I've gone through them multiple times, but not, so I know where stuff is generally, but now we need to organize it so it's accessible for more than just me, but is accessible to a larger community. So that's certainly something that my research assistant is working on right now, because we want to make sure that these materials are available to a wide public as possible.
And also, we just sent some additional boxes of materials that were in a filing cabinet that was in the storage unit. And that includes actually more of Martha's papers, although it does include some things like Jane's will and Doel's original will and so forth. But are you're one of Doel's nephews, is that right?
Yes. Yeah.
So in your case, if you wanted to come to Stillwater, I'm sure we could arrange with David Peters in the library for you to see things in special collections before everything's cataloged.
Well, I just saw my name and my parents' name and my brothers in some of these folders, and it was kind of interesting to see what those were and stuff like that. I did notice that you have down is correspondence from Dorothy Reed Strohmeyer.
Yes.
And says aunt. that's his sister.
That's his sister.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
So there's probably some corrections.
Yeah, that was my grandmother. So,
Mhm.
okay. I'm interested. You mentioned the Purple Heart because my brothers and family have always wondered if what happened to that because they remember being out there and seeing it. So,
Yeah, we definitely have those materials, and are being very careful with them because of course they're very important and meaningful for your family, but also for us from this sort of larger scholarly point of view. But also, Reed's life is so tied to the history of OSU. Well, he spent, of course, his formative
probably
years
why I went to
here.
school there too. So,
Yeah,
Great,
my
that's
father.
great.
great. So yeah, I'd be happy to, if you were to come here, happy to
okay.
share with you what we have.
His
And also-
correspondence is interesting. I've got a letter from him where he sent a book on the Rio Grande for my graduation in high school.
Nice.
Saw that. So, okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you.
Any other questions? So Rebecca, is this when you need to bow out?
I'm afraid so.
Okay.
Picking up the 14-year-old from tennis.
Well, thank you for joining us. I'm going to show a video that has Rebecca in it, so she doesn't have to endure watching her again.
Oh, I know, it's just painful. I'm sorry. But.
This video is produced by the O State TV for OSU, and
yeah, and I just wanted to mention it includes Cassidy, who's my curatorial assistant. So, all right, I'm running away.
okay,
Thank you, everybody.
bye.
Good to see you.
But I thought it was very well done. We're delighted that O State TV came in and spent quite a bit of time. We all started this project, actually, Rebecca said, 2018, but we started in 2015 because she was paying for research assistance. We were very grateful to Carl and Marilyn Thoma and the Terra Foundation for American Art giving us a grant in 2015 to do some of the seed, the basic work on it. And then we really started launching it. So the exhibition goes from here, closes the 31st of October, and we'll move from here to Wichita Art Museum. And then later next year. Thank you, Elizabeth. She's put a link in the chat box for that video as well. We'll go to Taos and the Taos Art Museum at Fechin House. We'll continue its trek, although a modified version because their space is not as large as the other two spaces here. So we're really delighted. It's taken a lot, our team we have crates that JM built to travel, a lot of people's goodwill and donations to fund this, because this has been an extraordinary process and lots of hands in it. But it's been very exciting all the way through to make this happen.